The Duke of Alistair Beaumont considered marriage the way he considered all things, as a problem of logistics. His title required an heir. His sprawling estates required a duchess. His life, a construct of impeccable order and disciplined solitude, required a companion who would not disrupt its careful architecture. He was 34 years old, a man forged in responsibility, not romance. He saw the world as a series of ledgers, and his own heart was the most closely guarded account of all. The problem of the bride had, like most problems, a practical solution. It presented itself in the form of a catastrophic debt, left behind by the late Baron Vance. The Baron had been a man of reckless optimism, and even more reckless investments, and his death revealed a financial ruin so complete it was almost an art form. The largest portion of that debt, a sum that could cripple a lesser dynasty, was owed to the Beaumont estate, and the late Baron had a daughter, Miss Eleanor Vance. Alistair had his solicitor, Mr. Fletcher, compile a report. The solicitor was a man as dry and precise as the legal documents he drafted, and his summary was efficient. 24 years old, educated but not brilliant, plain but not uncomely, quiet, well-mannered, and since her father's disgrace, entirely without prospects. She was, in essence, a line item in a ledger of ruin, the sole remaining asset of a bankrupt house. "It is a solution, Your Grace," Mr. Fletcher had said, his voice devoid of inflection. He did not say if it was a good one. He merely stated its existence. Alistair considered the facts. He would absorb the debt. In return, he would acquire a wife of suitable lineage, one whose precarious position would ensure her gratitude and compliance. She would be a duchess, a title that would solve her problems. She would give him an heir, a duty that would solve his. It was a transaction of perfect, dispassionate symmetry. There was no need for emotion to cloud the clean lines of the agreement. He met her in the faded drawing room of her family's rented London townhouse, a space that smelled of dust and decaying gentility. Eleanor Vance was exactly as the report had described. She was dressed in a simple gray gown that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Her hair was brown, her eyes were brown, and her expression was one of placid neutrality. She was not memorable. She was adequate. He made the offer through her aunt, a woman with frightened eyes and fluttering hands. He did not speak to Eleanor directly about the terms. It was indelicate. The arrangement was a matter of finance, and he treated it as such. The aunt, Lady Beatrice, wept with relief. Eleanor simply inclined her head, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere over his shoulder. He did not know that her gaze was fixed on a water stain on the wallpaper, a faint map of decay that she had been watching spread for 6 months. He did not know that in her mind she was calculating the rate of its expansion, a small, cold point of focus in a world that was dissolving around her. He saw a quiet woman. He did not see the formidable stillness of a person who had learned to survive by becoming invisible. She accepted. Of course, she accepted. What choice did she have? And so, the Duke of Alistair Beaumont, one of the most powerful men in England, became engaged to a woman he had mentally catalogued as uncomplicated. A woman who, he was quite certain, would make no inconvenient demands upon his time, his estate, or his emotions. He was a man who prided himself on his perception. It was the bedrock of his success. He had never been more wrong in his life. Their initial days as a married couple were a study in polite distance. Alistair escorted his new duchess to Blackwood Manor, his primary seat, a colossal testament to Palladian grandeur and centuries of accumulated power. The staff lined the entrance hall, a silent army of servants. Eleanor walked beside him, her expression as unreadable as it had been in the dusty London drawing room. She was present, and she was absent. She was there, and she was not there. He gave her a tour of the main wings. He showed her the dining rooms, the ballrooms, the galleries, hung with portraits of his ancestors, their painted eyes following them with proprietary disdain. He spoke of the estate's functions, the duties she would be expected to perform. She listened, nodded, and asked no questions. He found her silence restful. It was a pleasant, neutral space that confirmed his initial assessment. She was grateful. She was quiet. She was manageable. "The Duchess's wing is here," he said, gesturing to a set of carved oak doors. "My own chambers are in the east wing. We find it more practical for maintaining our own schedules." It was a dismissal, couched in the language of convenience. He was drawing the boundary of their transactional marriage. "Here is your domain. There is mine." "Thank you, Your Grace," she replied, her voice soft. "It seems very practical." He could not detect a trace of irony in her tone. He felt a brief, faint flicker of something. Disappointment? He dismissed it. This was what he wanted. An uncomplicated arrangement. One evening, a week into their new life, he found her in the library. The Blackwood Library was his father's legacy, a magnificent, two-story chamber containing one of the finest private collections in the country. It was also a chaotic disaster. The late Duke had been a scholar of immense intellect and zero organizational skill. Books were piled on floors, stacked precariously on tables, and shoved into shelves with no regard for subject or author. Alistair had always intended to have it catalogued, but it was a Herculean task he never found the time to begin. Eleanor was standing before a mountain of leather-bound folios, a small notebook in her hand. She was not reading. She was simply looking, her head tilted with an air of intense concentration. "An impressive collection," he said, his voice startling her. She turned, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. "It is, Your Grace. It is magnificent." "A magnificent mess," he countered with a dry smile. "My father believed chaos was the muse of genius." "Perhaps," she said softly. "Or perhaps he simply could not find anything." Alistair was taken aback by the subtle wit. It was the first spark of personality he had seen from her. He found himself intrigued. "You read a great deal, Duchess." "When I am able," she answered, her gaze returning to the books. It was not an evasion, but a simple statement of fact. Access to books had been a luxury her family could no longer afford. "You are able now," he stated, a hint of magnanimity in his tone. He was the provider, the granter of privileges. "Consider it your own." She gave a small, genuine smile then, and for the first time, he noticed the way it changed her face, softening the plainness into something gentle and appealing. "Thank you," she said, and this time, the words held a warmth that was entirely new. He left her there, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. He had given her a kingdom of books. It seemed a fair trade for the quiet order she brought to his life. Over the next few weeks, he would often see her in the library. She was always quiet, always industrious. He assumed she was reading, losing herself in novels and poetry, as women of her station were wont to do. He did not look closely at the small, neat labels she was affixing to the shelves. He did not notice the methodical system she was creating, sorting the chaos by subject, then by author, then by date of publication. He saw his quiet wife with her quiet hobby and was content. The second instance of surprise came a month later. Mr. Fletcher arrived from London with the quarterly estate accounts. It was Alistair's custom to review the ledgers himself, a practice that kept his managers sharp and his finances robust. He was in his study, a cavern of mahogany and leather, when Eleanor tapped lightly on the door. "Your Grace, I apologize for the interruption." She held a thin sheaf of papers. "I was reviewing the household accounts, as you suggested, and I noticed a small discrepancy. I believe the supplier for the London residence has been overcharging for grain deliveries for the past 6 months." Alistair paused, his pen hovering over a column of figures. He had given her the household ledgers as a matter of course, a simple duty to occupy her time. He had not expected her to do anything more than glance at them. "A discrepancy?" he asked, a hint of skepticism in his voice. His chief steward was a man of unimpeachable reputation. "Yes." She stepped forward, and laid a single sheet on his desk. On it, she had drawn a simple chart. Columns of dates, delivery amounts, and prices were noted in a small, precise hand. "You see here," she said, her finger tracing a line. "The market price for oats fell in March, but our invoiced price did not. The difference is small on each delivery, but over 6 months, it amounts to a significant sum." He looked at her chart. It was clear, concise, and utterly damning. It was the work of a keen, analytical mind. He had spent 2 days poring over the main estate ledgers and had not yet found an anomaly so subtle. "I see," he said slowly, looking from the paper to her face. Her expression was calm, her gaze direct. She was not seeking praise. She was simply presenting a fact. "You are quite certain of your calculations." "I am," she replied. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. This was not the uncomplicated woman from his solicitor's report. This was something else. A quiet competence hummed beneath her placid surface. It was unsettling. It did not fit the neat box into which he had placed her. "Thank you, Duchess," he said, his tone more formal than he intended. "I will have Mr. Fletcher look into this immediately." "Of course, Your Grace." She gave a slight curtsy and retreated, closing the door softly behind her. Alistair stared at the door for a long moment. He then picked up her paper and compared it to the thick ledger on his desk. She was right, down to the last shilling. He felt a prickle of irritation, an illogical annoyance, that she had seen something he and his highly paid staff had missed. But beneath the irritation was a burgeoning, unwelcome respect. He recalibrated his assessment of her. She was not merely quiet. She was observant. She was not merely plain. She possessed a subtle intelligence that was beginning to make itself known. This did not fundamentally change the nature of their arrangement, he told himself. It simply meant the asset he had acquired had hidden value. It was still a transaction. Alistair was required in the north for 2 weeks to inspect a series of mines that formed a significant part of his fortune. He disliked leaving Blackwood, but duty was the spine of his existence. On the evening before his departure, he sat in his study, composing a letter to Mr. Fletcher. It was a routine correspondence, updating the solicitor on various business matters. He wrote of the mines, of a land dispute with a neighboring earl, and of the discrepancy Eleanor had discovered in the accounts. "I have instructed the steward to be more diligent," he wrote. "It seems the Duchess has a surprising aptitude for figures, a quaint hobby, but useful in this instance." Then, his pen paused. He thought of his life at Blackwood now. The quiet dinners, the sight of her in the library, the sense of a steady, unobtrusive presence in the vast house. He thought of his peers, men like Lord Ashworth, who paraded their beautiful, vapid wives like prized mares. His own wife was different. She was a restful choice. He added a final paragraph, a moment of private reflection to his most trusted advisor. "The arrangement proceeds as expected. The Duchess is a model of propriety. She is quiet, efficient, and asks for nothing. She understands nothing of men like us, Fletcher, nor of the world we inhabit. She has no guile, no ambition beyond her station. In this, she is a perfect candidate for a quiet life, and, I trust, will prove a suitable mother to an heir. She is precisely what I required." He read the words over. They were cold. They were arrogant. They were also, he believed, entirely true. He was a man who dealt in truths, however uncomfortable. He folded the letter, sealed it with his ducal crest, and left it on the corner of his desk for the morning post. He did not see the young footman who, in his haste to clear the study for the night, collected the letter along with a stack of other papers. He did not see the footman trip on the edge of a rug in the hallway, scattering the papers. And he did not see that the letter to Mr. Fletcher slid unnoticed under a console table. Eleanor found it the next morning. She had risen early, as was her habit, and was walking through the main hall. The house was still, caught in the gray light of dawn. A glint of white under the hall table caught her eye. Thinking it a dropped note, She bent and picked it up. She saw the ducal seal, addressed to Mr. Fletcher. Assuming it was important and had been missed for the post, she intended to take it to the butler. But the wax of the seal was broken. It must have cracked when it fell. The letter was slightly open. She told herself not to read it. It was a breach of privacy, a violation of the trust that, however thin, existed between them. She held it in her hand, the paper cool against her skin. She stood there for a full minute, her own quiet, internal battle raging. Curiosity was a vulgar emotion, but this was not mere curiosity. This was a matter of survival. She needed to understand the man to whom her life was now bound. She needed to understand the precise terms of her own existence. She unfolded the letter. Her eyes scanned the pages, taking in the details of mines and land disputes with detached interest. Her mind, so recently praised for its aptitude for figures, absorbed the information effortlessly. Then she reached the final paragraph. She understands nothing of men like us, Fletcher, nor of the world we inhabit. The words did not strike her like a blow. They landed with the cold, silent precision of a shard of ice, lodging in her heart. She has no guile, no ambition beyond her station. She looked up from the letter, her gaze falling on her own reflection in the dark, polished surface of the hall table. She saw a plain woman in a simple morning dress, a ghost in a house of grandeur. He had looked at her and seen a placid surface, and he had assumed there were no depths beneath. He had mistaken stillness for simplicity. He had mistaken silence for ignorance. A perfect candidate for a quiet life. Precisely what I required. She was not a wife. She was a requirement, an asset, acquired to fulfill a function. He had praised her mind as a quaint hobby and dismissed her character as a blank slate upon which he could build his peaceful dynasty. A hot, furious wave of anger surged through her, so powerful it made her dizzy. It was followed by a grief so profound it felt like drowning. But she did not cry. Tears were a luxury she had learned to do without long ago. Tears were a petition for sympathy, and she would not petition this man for anything. Instead, a different feeling began to crystallize out of the pain. It was a cold, hard resolve. He believed she understood nothing. He would be given no reason to believe otherwise. He wanted a quiet, uncomplicated wife who asked for nothing. That is precisely what he would have. She did not tear the letter. She did not discard it. With meticulous care, she folded it along its original creases. The task required immense control, her fingers steady, while her entire world tilted on its axis. She slid it back into its envelope. Then she walked to his study. The room was empty, awaiting its master's departure. She placed the letter squarely in the center of his leather desk blotter, a silent, damning testament. Then she turned and walked away. A door had closed inside her. It had not slammed. It had clicked shut with quiet, irreversible finality. The part of her that had begun to cautiously emerge, the part that found joy in ordering a chaotic library, the part that felt satisfaction in untangling flawed accounts, the part that had begun to hope for a sliver of genuine connection, retreated deep inside, back to the silent, fortified place she had inhabited for years. The Duke of Alistair Beaumont would get his transaction. He would have his Duchess in name. But Eleanor Vance, the woman he had failed to see, was gone. Alistair returned from the north, 2 weeks later, tired and satisfied. The mining operations were secure. The land dispute was settled in his favor, and he felt the familiar contentment of a man whose world was in order. He anticipated returning to the quiet rhythm of his life at Blackwood, to the restful presence of his new wife. But the house felt different. The change was subtle, a shift in the atmosphere that he could not immediately name. The air itself seemed thinner, the silence in the vast halls no longer peaceful, but empty. He dismissed it as fatigue from his journey. At dinner that evening, Eleanor was dressed impeccably. She inquired after his trip with perfect politeness. She listened to his account of the mines with an expression of mild interest, but her eyes were distant. When he finished speaking, a silence fell over the table, and for the first time, it felt awkward. Previously, their silences had been comfortable, filled with the unspoken hum of two people coexisting. This silence was a void. "Have you spent much time in the library?" he asked, attempting to draw her out. "Not recently, Your Grace," she replied, her voice a placid stream. "I have been occupied with other matters." He waited for her to elaborate. She did not. She took a small, precise sip of water, her gaze directed at the centerpiece of flowers on the table. He noticed then that the arrangement was stiff and formal, a generic explosion of hothouse roses utterly unlike the simple, elegant compositions of wildflowers and greenery she had previously favored. The next day, he walked past the library. The doors were closed. He opened one and peered inside. The room was still. The faint, pleasant scent of lemon oil and old paper was gone. A film of dust was beginning to settle on the tables. The small, neat cart she had used to transport books stood abandoned in a corner, a half-sorted stack of restoration poetry sitting on its lower shelf. The grand project of organization had ceased. He began to notice other things, an accumulation of clues. He noticed her absence from the breakfast room. She now took a tray in her rooms, a habit she had not had before his departure. He noticed that her music had stopped. She had a small pianoforte in her private sitting room, and in the evenings, he had grown accustomed to hearing the faint, delicate sound of her playing. Now, there was only silence. He noticed that at dinner, her plate was often cleared with most of the food untouched. She was a ghost in her own life. She performed her duties as Duchess with flawless precision. She managed the household staff, approved menus, and appeared at his side when required for social obligations. But she did it all with the remote efficiency of a well-made automaton. The spark of wit, the flash of intelligence, the quiet warmth he had begun to glimpse, it was all gone. She was exactly the woman he had thought he was marrying, and he found he could not bear it. The emptiness of her presence was a constant, low-grade irritant that grew into a profound disquiet. He had wanted a wife who would not disrupt the architecture of his life, but her withdrawal had dismantled it. The order he cherished now felt like a sterile prison. He had wanted a quiet life, but he had not understood that there were two kinds of quiet, the quiet of peace and the quiet of absence. His home was now filled with the latter. He thought about the ledgers. He thought about the library. He thought about the unexpected, intelligent woman he had been briefly married to. And he thought about this polite, hollow stranger who now bore her name. What had happened in the 2 weeks he was gone? The catalyst arrived in the form of Mr. Fletcher. The solicitor came down from London to finalize the paperwork on the land acquisition. They were in Alistair's study when the Duke, unable to contain his unease any longer, made a vague complaint. "The atmosphere in this house has become oppressive," Alistair said, swirling the brandy in his glass. "I cannot pinpoint the cause." Mr. Fletcher, who noticed everything, adjusted his spectacles. He had seen the Duchess at luncheon. He had observed her perfect, chilling courtesy. He had also noted, on his way to the study, that the Duke's personal correspondence from a fortnight ago was still sitting on the hall table, which was highly irregular, but the seal on the letter addressed to him was intact. A different letter, then. "Indeed, Your Grace," the solicitor said, his voice as dry as dust. "Her Grace seems to have retreated. The household runs with impeccable efficiency, of course, but I was informed that the Duchess has not requested access to the estate ledgers for over a month. I believe that coincides with the week of your departure for the north." The words were a key turning in a rusted lock. A month. The change had begun precisely when he had left. Alistair's mind raced. What had he done? What had he said before he left? Nothing. They had spoken of his trip, of the weather. It was unremarkable. Then he remembered the letter to Fletcher. He had a sudden cold premonition. He had left it on his desk. He never received a reply from Fletcher. regarding that specific paragraph. He had assumed the solicitor, in his typical fashion, had deemed it unworthy of comment. He stood up and walked over to the large mahogany desk. He searched the pigeonholes, the drawers. It was not there. His gaze swept the room, and then he froze. On the corner of the blotter, where he never left his outgoing mail, was a single letter. It was addressed to Mr. Fletcher in his own hand. His heart began to beat a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. He picked it up. The seal was broken. That was not how he had left it. With trembling fingers, he unfolded the pages. The paper felt different. The creases were too sharp, too precise, as if folded by a person exercising immense self-control. He read his own words, but they were alien to him now, filtered through the lens of the past month of cold, empty silence. A surprising aptitude for figures, a quaint hobby. The condescension was staggering. He had praised her mind and simultaneously dismissed it as a trifle. She understands nothing of men like us. She has no guile, no ambition. The arrogance, the sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it. He had judged her, weighed her, and found her simple. He had written her off as a naive creature who could not possibly comprehend the cynical machinations of his world. Precisely what I required. The final words were a death sentence. He had laid out the cold, transactional truth of their marriage and his own emotional bankruptcy on a page for her to see. The epiphany was not a gentle dawn. It was a bolt of lightning that illuminated the full landscape of his foolishness. He saw it all in a sickening, clarifying rush. He saw her finding the letter. He saw her reading his brutal assessment. He saw her not in a fit of tears, but in a moment of cold, profound understanding. She had not misunderstood him. She had understood him perfectly. She had understood that he saw her as a tool. She had understood that he valued her silence over her substance. She had understood his praise of her intelligence was merely an appreciation for a useful feature of an asset he had acquired. And she had acted, not with hysterics or accusations, which he would have dismissed as feminine weakness. No, her response had been as intelligent and precise as her analysis of the grain accounts. She had simply withdrawn. She had taken away the very things he had unknowingly come to value: her quiet companionship, her sharp mind, her gentle presence, and had given him exactly what he had claimed to want: a silent, uncomplicated figurehead. He thought of the abandoned library, a monument to her silenced intellect. He thought of the untouched meals, the empty music room. He had not broken her spirit. He had insulted it, and her spirit, so much stronger than he had ever imagined, had simply retreated to a place where he could not wound it further. "My God," he whispered, sinking into the chair behind his desk. The letter fell from his hand. "What have I done?" Mr. Fletcher, who had watched the entire drama unfold on the Duke's face, merely pushed his spectacles higher on his nose. "It appears, Your Grace," he said with profound understatement, "that you have made an error in your calculations." Alistair looked at the old solicitor, his eyes filled with a dawning horror. "She saw it all, Fletcher. She saw me, the real me, the arrogant, blind fool." Anaphora seized his thoughts. He thought about her quiet dignity in that dusty London room. He thought about the subtle wit he had so easily dismissed. He thought about the focused intelligence she had applied to his father's chaotic library and his own complex accounts. He thought about the woman he had married and the woman he had created through his own callous stupidity. He was a man who fixed problems. This was not a problem of logistics. This was a wreckage of the human heart, and the fault was entirely his. He had to find her. He had to speak to her, not to ask for forgiveness. What right had he to ask for anything? But to confess, to admit the full, catastrophic scale of his blindness. He stood, the lethargy of his despair replaced by a desperate, urgent need for action. He had to find his wife. He searched the house first. Her sitting room was empty. The pianoforte closed and silent. The library was deserted. The gardens near the house were vacant. The staff, when questioned, reported that the Duchess often took long walks, alone. Alistair felt a rising panic. It was an unfamiliar, unwelcome emotion. He was a man in control, yet he had lost all control of the one thing that was beginning to matter most. He strode through the corridors of his own home like a stranger, searching for a woman he had rendered invisible. He remembered a story his father once told him about the West Wing Conservatory. It had been his grandmother's passion, a beautiful glass house filled with exotic plants. After her death, it had fallen into neglect, a place of broken panes and botanical ghosts, a place of forgotten things. He went there. The air inside was cool and damp, smelling of earth and decay. Sunlight streamed through the grimy glass, illuminating dust motes dancing over tangled dead vines and skeletal trees in terracotta pots. It was a cathedral of neglect. And in the center of it, he saw her. Eleanor was kneeling on the stone floor. She had cleared a small area around a single, stubborn plant. A camellia bush, its leaves a deep, glossy green, with one perfect, waxy white blossom defying the surrounding decay. She was methodically picking dead leaves from its base, her movements careful and deliberate. She did not seem to have heard him enter. He watched her for a long moment, his heart aching. Here she was, in this forgotten corner of his world, tending to the only living thing she could find. He saw in that simple act a metaphor for her own existence in his house, a quiet, resilient life, persisting amidst neglect. He took a step forward, and a piece of fallen glass crunched under his boot. She looked up, her eyes widening slightly in surprise. There was no fear in them, only a weary resignation. She slowly rose to her feet, brushing dirt from her skirt. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was flat. He walked towards her, stopping a few feet away. He held the letter in his hand. It felt heavy, toxic. "I came to find you," he said, his own voice sounding strained. "As you see, you have," she replied, her gaze moving past him to a shattered pane of glass. The polite, impenetrable wall was still there. He had to break it down, not with force, but with the one thing he had so spectacularly failed to offer her, the truth. "I read it," he began, his voice low and raw. "I reread my letter to Fletcher." He held it out, not for her to take, but as evidence of his crime. "I wrote this." She said nothing. She simply watched him, her face a mask of neutrality. "I was a fool," he said, the words tasting like ash. "A blind, arrogant fool." He took a breath, forcing himself to meet her empty gaze. "I wrote that you understood nothing of my world. The irony is that I understood nothing of you. I looked at you, and I saw a solution, a convenience. I saw what I wanted to see, a quiet, simple woman who would not challenge me." His voice cracked, but he pressed on. "I failed to see your intelligence. I failed to see your strength. I failed to see your grace. I saw a woman who could balance a ledger, and I called it a quaint hobby because my own vanity could not admit that you saw things I had missed. I saw a woman who brought a quiet order to my life, and I assumed it was because you had no life of your own." He stepped closer. "I was wrong. I was wrong about all of it. I was wrong about you." He did not say he was sorry. The words were too small, too easy. An apology asks for something in return. Forgiveness. He was not asking. He was confessing. He was laying his own flawed character bare before her, just as he had unwittingly laid it bare in his letter. "The woman I described in this letter," he said, his eyes burning with unshed tears, "the simple, ignorant creature, she does not exist. I invented her. I invented her so I would not have to deal with a real woman, with a real mind, and a real heart. I have been living with a ghost of my own making, while the real you was right here, suffering my blindness in silence." For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed her face. a tremor of her lower lip, so slight he might have imagined it. "You are not what I required, Eleanor," he finished, using her given name for the first time without the title of Duchess attached. "You are what I failed to deserve." He let the letter drop from his hand. It fluttered to the stone floor, landing beside the pile of dead leaves she had gathered. He had said it all. He had admitted everything. He stood before her, stripped of his ducal arrogance, a man admitting his complete and utter failure. He waited. She looked from his face down to the letter, then back to him. The silence stretched, thick with the damp air of the conservatory. He had expected anger, perhaps, or tears. He had even prepared himself for a cold dismissal. He was not prepared for what she said. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked, her voice quiet but clear, stripped of its earlier flatness. It was a genuine question. "Because," he struggled for the words, "because living in the house you have left behind is unbearable. The silence is not peaceful. It is a judgment." She considered this, her head tilted. "You are uncomfortable," she stated. It was not an accusation, but an observation. "Yes," he admitted, "I am. And you wish for your comfort to be restored." He flinched as if struck. She had cut directly to the selfish heart of his motive. Was this just another transaction? His comfort in exchange for his confession? "No," he said, shaking his head fiercely. "No, that is not. I am telling you because you deserve to hear it. You deserve to know that I see you. Now, finally." She held his gaze for a long, searching moment. He felt as if she were looking directly into his soul, weighing every word, every flicker of his expression. He did not look away. He let her see all of it. The shame, the regret, the desperate, terrifying hope. Then, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She bent down, not to pick up his letter, but to pluck one last dead leaf from the base of the camellia. She straightened up and looked at the single, perfect white blossom. "It survived the winter," she said softly. "I thought it was dead." Then she turned and walked out of the conservatory, leaving him alone with the wreckage of his words and the one, small, living thing. He had confessed. He had not been absolved. A week later, they attended the Duchess of Abernathy's annual ball. It was the glittering pinnacle of the London season, an obligation Alistair could not avoid. He dreaded it. He dreaded the public performance of a happy marriage, the polite charade he would have to enact with a wife who was still, essentially, a stranger. Eleanor was breathtaking. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk that shimmered under the chandeliers, turning her eyes to chips of jade. The severe hairstyle she usually favored was gone, replaced by a soft arrangement of curls that framed her face. She was not plain. She had never been plain. He had simply been blind. As they entered the ballroom, a murmur went through the crowd. He was acutely aware of the stares, the whispers. He was the formidable Duke of Alistair Beaumont, and this was the first major appearance of his surprising, quiet bride. He felt her hand tremble slightly on his arm. He covered it with his own, a gesture that was both protective and possessive. She did not pull away. They were making their way through the crush when Lord Ashworth appeared before them. Ashworth was a man who moved through life with the casual cruelty of the perpetually entitled. He and Alistair shared a mutual, thinly veiled contempt. "Well, Beaumont," Ashworth drawled, his eyes sliding over Eleanor with insolent appraisal. "I see you have your little mouse in hand. Tell me, does she squeak when you—" He never finished the sentence. Alistair moved so quickly it was almost a blur. He did not raise his voice. He did not cause a scene. He simply stepped in front of Eleanor, blocking her from Ashworth's view. His height, his sheer physical presence, was suddenly menacing. The air around them went cold. "Ashworth," Alistair said, and his voice was dangerously quiet, a silken threat that cut through the ballroom chatter. Every head within 10 feet turned towards them. "You will address my wife, the Duchess of Alistair Beaumont, with the respect she is due." He paused, letting the silence hang. "Or you and I will have a conversation tomorrow at dawn. A conversation from which I assure you, only one of us will walk away." The threat was unmistakable. It was a direct challenge. Ashworth's smug expression dissolved, replaced by a pasty shock. To be called out so publicly, so lethally, by a man of Alistair's stature was a social death sentence. I meant no offense, Beaumont," he stammered. "You will apologize to the Duchess," Alistair commanded, his voice like chips of ice. Ashworth, his face now a mottled red, turned his gaze to Eleanor. He could barely meet her eyes. "Your Grace," he mumbled, "my apologies." Alistair did not move. He waited. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "See that it does not happen again." He then took Eleanor's arm, turned his back on the humiliated lord, and calmly continued their path through the ballroom, as if nothing had happened. The crowd parted before them like the Red Sea. He had defended her, absolutely, publicly. He had wrapped his power and his name around her like a shield. When they found a quiet alcove, he turned to her, his heart still pounding with cold fury. "Are you all right?" She looked up at him, and for the first time since she had read his letter, the mask was gone. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, but with a kind of stunned appraisal. She had seen the raw, protective power he wielded. She had seen him use it for her. She gave a small, slow nod. It was not a capitulation. It was an acknowledgement, a single data point added to a complex equation. The confession in the conservatory had been words. This was an act. He had shown her, he could see her. Now he had shown the world they would see her too. The dynamic between them shifted after the ball. The impenetrable wall of her politeness developed a hairline crack. She did not revert to the woman she had been before the letter. That woman was gone forever. But a new one began to emerge, more cautious, more watchful, but present. She began to join him for breakfast again. Their conversations were stilted at first, confined to neutral topics, the weather, the news from the papers. But Alistair did not push. He had learned his lesson. He waited. He listened. He began to court his own wife. He noticed her looking at a book of architectural drawings of famous glass houses. The next day he brought in the finest architect in London. He took him and Eleanor to the derelict West Wing Conservatory. "The Duchess will be overseeing a complete restoration," he informed the bewildered architect. "Her budget is unlimited. Her authority is absolute." Eleanor stared at him, shocked into silence. He simply met her gaze, a silent question in his eyes. "Will you accept?" After a long moment, she turned to the architect and began to speak, her voice hesitant at first, then gaining confidence as she described her vision for the space. A haven of light and life, filled with camellias, orchids, and ferns. Alistair stood back and listened, a profound sense of rightness settling over him. He was not giving her a hobby. He was returning a piece of her kingdom. He learned her. He paid attention. He discovered she loved the poetry of Donne, but disliked Byron. He found out she preferred tea to coffee, morning to evening, and the sharp scent of rain on dry earth above all other perfumes. These were small things, tiny, insignificant details, but his entire world had been upended by his failure to notice the details. Now, he collected them like jewels. One evening, he came into the library to find her there, not sorting books, but reading. He sat in the chair opposite her, picking up a book of his own. They sat in silence for an hour, the only sound the soft rustle of turning pages. It was not an empty silence. It was a shared peace, a quiet so full and profound, it was more intimate than any conversation. The external world, however, did not stand still. Lord Ashworth, humiliated and vengeful, sought his revenge, not on the dueling field, but in the marketplace. He began a subtle campaign to manipulate grain prices in the north, knowing Alistair's estates were heavily dependent on the autumn harvest. It was a sophisticated attack. designed to cause a cascade of financial losses that would be felt for years. Alistair's managers were in a panic. The strategy was complex, the source of the market pressure difficult to trace. Alistair spent days locked in his study with Mr. Fletcher, poring over reports, trying to anticipate Ashworth's next move. He was deep in thought one afternoon, when Eleanor entered, carrying a tray with tea and a plate of sandwiches. She had taken to doing this, small acts of care that spoke more than words. She set the tray down, and her eyes fell on the charts spread across his desk. "This is Ashworth's doing," he said, the frustration evident in his voice. She looked at the charts, her expression thoughtful. She was silent for a long moment, tracing the patterns of trade with her finger. "He is creating artificial scarcity to drive up the price before he floods the market from his own granaries," she said. Alistair and Fletcher both stared at her. She had summarized in a single sentence what had taken them 3 days to decipher. "How did you know that?" Alistair asked, amazed. "It is the same pattern as the London grain supplier," she said simply. "The one who was overcharging us, just on a much larger scale. The logic is identical." She pointed to a specific point on the map. "You are trying to counter him here, in the main markets. But the key is here, his secondary distribution network. If you buy up the transport contracts from these smaller ports, he will have no way to move his grain to market when the price is at its peak. He will be trapped with a surplus he cannot sell." It was brilliant, it was audacious, and it would work. Alistair looked at her, and the last vestiges of his old perception of her crumbled into dust. This was not a woman with a quaint hobby for figures. This was a strategic mind, a partner. "Fletcher," he said, his voice alive with new energy, "get me the shipping manifests for every port between here and Newcastle." They worked together for the next week. It was no longer his problem, it was theirs. Eleanor sat with them in the study, her quiet insights and sharp analysis proving more valuable than that of his entire team of financial advisors. She did not intrude, she simply offered her thoughts when asked, each one a model of clarity and logic. They were a team, a partnership. In the end, her strategy was devastatingly effective. Ashworth was ruined, his scheme collapsing around him. Alistair's fortune was secure. That evening, after the news of their victory arrived, Alistair found her in the conservatory. The restoration was nearly complete. The glass gleamed, and the air was warm and fragrant with the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers. The camellia bush she had first tended now had dozens of white blossoms. She was standing in the center of the room, her hand resting on a new leaf of a young orange tree. He came and stood beside her. "We did it," he said softly. "Yes," she said, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips. "We did." He turned to face her, taking her hands in his. They were small and felt fragile, but he knew the strength they contained. "Eleanor," he began, his heart beating a steady, certain rhythm, "when I married you, it was a transaction, a foolish, arrogant contract made by a man who could not see past his own ledgers. I asked you to be my duchess." He tightened his grip on her hands. "I am asking you now to be my wife, not in name, not for an heir or for my estate, but in truth, to be my partner, my confidant, my friend, to share my life not as a requirement, but as its center." He looked into her eyes, holding nothing back. "The debt of your father is a ghost. It means nothing. It has meant nothing for a long time. I am the one who is in your debt. I love you," he said, the words feeling more true and real than anything he had ever said. "I love your mind, and your strength, and your quiet, resilient heart. I love you." Tears welled in her eyes, the tears he had never seen her shed. They were not tears of sorrow or anger, but of a profound, overwhelming release. They traced shimmering paths down her cheeks. "Alistair," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She did not need to say more. He saw her answer in her shining eyes. He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that was not about passion or possession, but about recognition. It was the meeting of two souls who had finally, truly, seen each other. The old contract was void. A new one, written on the heart, had just been sealed. 1 year later, the conservatory was a lush paradise, a green and vibrant heart in the center of Blackwood Manor. It was Eleanor's domain, but it was their sanctuary. Alistair stood by the windows, watching the autumn rain streak the glass. He was holding his son, a small, warm bundle named Arthur, who was just 3 months old. The infant was asleep, his tiny face a perfect miniature of Eleanor's calm features. Across the room, Eleanor was talking to the head gardener, her voice confident and clear as she discussed the new orchids that had just arrived from the Orient. She laughed at something he said, a full, musical sound that filled the warm air. She was radiant. Motherhood had not softened her. It had illuminated her. Her intelligence was still sharp, her wit still dry, but now it was all underpinned by a deep, abiding joy. She was the undisputed mistress of Blackwood, not by title, but by merit. The staff adored her. The estate prospered under her watchful eye, and the house itself seemed to breathe more easily, filled with her light. She finished her conversation and came towards him. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand coming up to gently stroke their son's cheek. "He's sleeping," she murmured. "He is peaceful," Alistair replied, his gaze on her face. He thought back to the man he had been, the man who stood in a dusty London room and saw a suitable arrangement, the man who had written a letter full of blind, dismissive arrogance. It felt like a lifetime ago, a different man entirely. That man had looked at this woman and seen a solution to a problem. Now, he looked at her and saw the answer to a question he had never known he was asking. He saw his partner, his love, his entire world. He had learned that true sight had nothing to do with looking, and everything to do with seeing. He had learned that love was not a disruption of order, but the creation of a new, more profound order. And he had learned that the quietest people often have the most to say, if one only has the wisdom to listen. Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes full of a deep, knowing love. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He smiled, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "I was just balancing the accounts," he said softly, "and finding myself a very, very wealthy man." She understood perfectly.